Over the last few weeks, we've been looking at a series of connected values and virtues within the context of Buddhism. And up until now, we've looked at 3 different ones, which some of you may have caught along the way. Things like not associating with so-called fools, associating instead with the wise, expressing respect towards those worthy of respect. And all those 3 belonged to the most basic of the teachings within what's known as the Mangala Sutta, or the blessings of life teaching in Buddhism. And the idea of those 3 that we've already studied were to do with turning our backs on any bad habits that we might have in our lives. And having turned our back on those things, we now have the chance to turn towards new and better things. And it brings us today to the second group of blessings, of which the 4th blessing is the first. It's themed turning towards good habits. And we see that the first of these is one of the rare examples of spiritual wisdom that includes the idea of the environment, which is the conducive location, or the idea of Feng Shui. Probably not pronouncing it correctly. But even Feng Shui has its roots in probably some Buddhist knowledge as well. In developmental psychology, the central discussion has always been about the relative importance of nature and nurture. Nature being our genetic component, and nurture being the influence of our environment and the people around us. So for science, it's always been the idea of those factors affecting things like adaptation to the environment, things like camouflage or body size, which might help with the survival of the fittest. But in terms of spiritual wisdom, when we're talking about nature and nurture, in fact, we're not so interested in survival, but more in the idea of spiritual maturity. Yeah? Maturing spiritually, cultivating spirituality. So the 4th blessing, which we're going to make a start on today, is the first of the second group of blessings. Comes in at number 4 in the 38 blessings. And it is the thing which is up front in turning towards wholesomeness or good habits in life. And the nurture part is very much connected with our environment, but as we shall see, it's not just the sort of trees in the forest, but it includes many aspects, including the people in our environment as well. After that, we'll go on to look at more of the nature aspects, what we bring to the table personally, which is to do with the dispositions which we have cultivated for ourselves in the past. In other words, the store of merits in our past. And the last of the second group of blessings is going to be to do with how good we are at having a clear idea of where we are aiming for, or our sense of purpose in life, having a clear direction. Yeah, so 3 things which we'll be looking at over the course of the next few weeks. But today we're going to start with the conducive location part, at least half of it. And it's said that rather like a bonsai tree, which if it was planted in the right place could become a full-size tree, bonsai tree. But if you put it in a place where its roots are very cramped and limited, then it will only ever grow to this size. And in the same way with spirituality, if we don't find ourselves in a conducive environment, then no matter how hard we might try, that we can't grow to our full maturity. This is the idea of taking into account the idea of location or especially conducive location in considering the things that may help or hinder our spiritual progress. Yeah? So we know that location is important. And if there are any real estate agents here, then you probably will be familiar with the idea of nothing exceeding location in importance. Location, 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 the three most important thing about any property you might buy. But location for different purposes, of course, has different things which it emphasizes. If you are trying to catch fish, then of course the sort of location you'll be looking for is maybe the place which is closest to the fish breeding grounds. Maybe somewhere on the coast, or maybe out in the sea. If you're in business, then it might not be the sea you're interested in. It might be more like a lively marketplace where you've got plenty of potential customers walking past your shop window. If you're a monk, well, maybe you don't want the hustle and bustle of the marketplace. That wouldn't be very good for a temple, right? You need to sort of extract yourself to a reasonable distance, to a place where you have peace and quiet, enough to meditate, but not so far away in a forest somewhere that no one can be bothered to visit you anymore. So you'd be maybe on the suburbs somewhere. If you are a soldier, then your whole idea of location might be to do with strategy. You want to be on the high ground, for example. So location can be applied in different ways depending on what you are interested in cultivating, what you're interested in succeeding at. And sometimes you might consider location in terms of the big picture, the macrocosm, the climate of a country, the connections a country has with its neighboring countries. Or you might bring it right down to the microcosm, where even if you are sitting on one side of the table rather than another, it might make a slight difference to the effectiveness of whatever you happen to be doing. For example, if you're sitting facing the door, you know who's going to come in, rather than having your back to the door. It makes a difference. Yeah? So you can consider it in terms of the macrocosm or in terms of microcosm. All these things are considered important if you are really getting down into the details of conducive location. So, why do I call it Feng Shui? Yeah, correct me if the pronunciation is bad. Okay. Feng Shui actually is an idea of geomancy, so sort of being able to make predictions based on location or geography, which comes from the Orient. And as you can see from the background of this picture, it's very, very complicated. Can be. For example, if you are going to set up a new building, then you might get an expert in to tell you if it's facing in the right direction or how you've laid out the rooms in your building in order to get the maximum of effectiveness or success in your life. It wasn't very well known in the West, but apparently when Richard Nixon visited China in 1972, these sort of ideas started to be communicated more to the West. And if you go and look for Feng Shui in your local bookshop or whatever, then you find lots of ideas for decorating rooms in order to maximize the flow of energy, etc., etc. Things like not leaving your lucite up. Yeah? Yeah, and sometimes it's not very clear what exactly is trying to achieve. But from our point of view, from a more Buddhist point of view, we're not just talking about general energy, but we're talking more about cultivating wisdom. What sort of environment would be really good for you to cultivate wisdom in your life towards enlightenment of some sort, in order to fill in the gaps in your spiritual knowledge. Some people, rather like the bonsai tree, may have a very high IQ, they might have a lot of potential, capability, but if they're put in the wrong environment, like some person with a doctorate who's stranded on a desert island somewhere, then they wouldn't be able to make full use of what they know or be able to extend their knowledge. However, if you, even with little knowledge, but put in a good environment, you could make huge strides in your life for the better. So this is the idea of considering why the location is important. And within the context we're looking at today, there are 4 factors of a conducive environment which we are particularly interested in from the point of view of cultivating spiritual knowledge. Are you interested to know what they are? Well, they are conducive location, but not just location, also conducive food or food supply, conducive neighbors, so that's the human element, and also having teachings or Dharma available in that environment. So even in some economically prosperous countries, so think about G5 or G8 countries, G20, normally you would consider them successful countries because they are economically successful. But what you might not have found if you look deeper is that some of those countries, although they may be economically quite lively, but spiritually speaking or in terms of wisdom, they may be lacking. Because it's not all just about the economy. It's not all about the material things. Often, the more materially oriented a country or an economy is, the more it neglects the spiritual aspects. So what we're looking at here is the aspect of the spiritual knowledge as well. Not saying that economics is not important, because of course food and sometimes social justice and that sort of thing depends on the economy too. But from the point of view of cultivating wisdom, then there needs to be something more than just everyone making a fast buck. I'm not saying that being employed or being able to be socially mobile is a bad thing. All of those things help to sustain the opportunities for spiritual growth as well, but it's not the whole story. So this is why we need to look at all 4, so that there's also the opportunity to cultivate spiritual values, spiritual abundance in life. Otherwise, you might be in quite a materially prosperous country, but you may be none the wiser spiritually speaking. So what we're going to do is go through each of these 4 factors and see on the national level, on the local level, on a neighborhood level, and on a household level, what those factors might mean in a way that hopefully might be useful to you if you ever are in the position that you're trying to choose a place that is conducive to your cultivation of spiritual values. So the first we'll start with is that of location. So on a national level, location, which is conducive, might mean a conducive climate, not too hot, not too cold. It might mean that a landscape is not too rugged. If you are building your house in water meadows somewhere, then they might be liable to flooding, so that probably isn't a great idea. And also the place you're in, if it has convenient connections with the rest of the world, then that's also a plus. This is on the top level, national sort of level. Some countries, for example, they don't have a seaboard. Hard to imagine for People living on an island, perhaps, but some countries don't have any seaports, right? And all their trade has to go through a second country, which is particularly difficult for people in that country, which is sort of isolated somehow by that. Okay, going down to the local level, things like unemployment, social infrastructure, and things like having clean water on tap. It's not things that you can assume you're going to have everywhere. We're lucky, but in some places that might not be quite so convenient. Coming down to the neighborhood level, it might be down to things like traffic, road system, good communications. Do you have broadband? And again, things like flooding. Yeah? Coming down from the neighborhood level down to individual level of your own home, which is maybe where you have a little bit more influence yourself. Things that make for a conducive household are maybe a well-planned house, good ventilation, maybe trees giving shade around your home, have the availability of parks nearby, no disturbance from noise. Probably these days you'd have to think of things like the quality of the air. And if it's a temple, then a conducive temple, it would need to be sufficiently spacious to be able to have all the activities that you would wish to hold in it. Location. Next, food. So let's go to the food part. On a national level, conducive food might mean a country being self-sufficient in the food it needs. Is Britain self-sufficient in its food? How much they import from Europe? We tend to become slightly more aware of that these days. If you just want to eat potatoes the whole time. But some countries have to import everything. Think about the countries in the Middle East, for example. If you live in a desert, then you need to import all your food, which adds to the cost of even the basic necessities for people who live there. On a local level, then you might be down to things like the availability of home produce, markets nearby. Some places get flooded, so the food can't get through. But if people have grown their own food, maybe they have cottage gardens, then they can survive off their home produce for maybe a whole month before food supplies make it through again, which has got to be an advantage, right? And some places they only plant cash crops, which means that they can't eat any of the things they've actually gone to the trouble of planting. If they're growing coffee, for example, or maize, then you can't eat that. It's not for sort of human consumption. So sometimes having things which you can eat, a little sort of garden at the back of your house where you've grown sort of basic vegetables can be really helpful at a pinch. On the neighborhood level, it might mean a fresh food market nearby where you live. And on the household level, okay, you might have stocked up your house with lots of food, but having a good cook in the house also adds to the amenability or conduciveness of the food in your house, because even with the best raw materials, if no one knows how to cook, then your whole food menu will be a disaster. You have great things in this country like the Great British Bake Off to encourage people to learn how to make simple food more professionally. Yeah, I don't think any other country has that. So it's something to be proud of. There's a tradition for at least making cakes like well. And if you don't know how to cook, some people have got lots of excuses about this. You know, they've got evening classes and this sort of thing. At least there ought to be at least one thing you can cook well for everybody. And it's the sort of thing that you ought to teach your children to do as well, in order to make your home a little bit more amenable on the food front. Neighbors or personnel, are they conducive? Well, this is maybe one factor that no one really thinks about when they are thinking of the environment, but certainly the human environment is particularly important from the point of view of spiritual wisdom, because on a national level, if you have the wrong sort of people dominating the country and the sense of justice in that country, then you are in big trouble. Even if you try to be decent and honest, then you get punished for it if you are with the wrong sort of people, or if the wrong sort of people prevail in your country. So, in fact, the quality of the neighbors you have, or the fellow country people and their values that they have, is particularly important from the point of view of spiritual cultivation. So on a national level, often the idea of right livelihood is particularly important. Are you familiar with this concept? Right livelihood? People earning their living. Many people just think as long as you get a good income, then that's fine. But if you get a good income from selling things which are maybe taking advantage of your customers, selling things like drugs, for example, or weapons, although you might make lots of money, but the repercussions of the things that you sell to your clients is going to destroy the fabric of the society that you live in. So that's known as wrong livelihood, just to give two examples there. So if there's a prevalence of things like gangs or terrorists or extortionists, then it threatens the very fabric of that society, just because of the people who share your society. So your neighbors, in other words. On the local level, then you might think about materialistic values. Have they displaced any spiritual values in your society? Some societies are more spiritual than others, and it may not necessarily be the richer ones that have the better spiritual values. Neighborhood level, it would come down to things like whether you have people in your society who are willing to go out of their way to help the others around them, or who are qualified to help those around them. I'm thinking particularly of, let's say, people with medical knowledge, where without such people, then any small illness that you have would end up being fatal. Yeah? But having doctors and nurses around in society, it just improves the whole quality of that society for everybody. Not just that, but also you need people in society who are willing to invest in their fellows in order to help that society to move to a better level. So-called benefactors or patrons in society are also, the very presence of people like that will upgrade or allow the quality of that society to upgrade itself. And there's a story I'd like to tell about something from the time of the Buddha, where there was a plan where they were going to establish a new city. And this came at a time in ancient India where the whole of society was moving from an agrarian society where people were basically living from hand to mouth, living off the harvest and, trying to sustain themselves from year to year, moving to a more mercantile society where people are starting to stock up on things and trade with one another. And because of this ability to trade, then society suddenly had a lot more possibilities, including being able to support a whole community of monks, for example, in their society. So it became much more interesting from the point of view of spiritual knowledge. And at this time, there was a king in India, and he had plenty of builders and planners, and he wanted to create a new city. And the city which he wanted to build in the Buddhist scripture is called Saket. These days it's known as Ayodhya in India. And the city that was planned to build looks something like this. This is a model of it from one of the Jain temples. But it goes back to the time of 2,000 years ago. So you can imagine to build a huge city like this was quite an ambitious plan. So you might have the planners, you might have the builders, but without someone to invest in this, to put out the money, to make it happen, then it could never come to fruition. So at that time, the king involved, he didn't have the money himself, he just had the wish to do this. He had to borrow investors from a city that had already established itself. And in this particular case, the lady who we met up with, called Visakha, who was a great supporter of the Buddha, actually moved, her father was moved as the investor for the new city, almost like a banker. Almost like a banker. And because of that, then the city could be established successfully. But without a person like that willing to invest in strangers, basically, in a new city, then that could never come to fruition. So doctors, investors, who else is necessary? Well, also wise ones, who we've met already in blessing number 2, are important to have. Because without people to share the spiritual knowledge, then where is the knowledge going to come from? It doesn't just fall out of the sky. It doesn't just come as part of the government policy. You need someone who has the knowledge to be able to share it. So we have medical, investment, wisdom, in order to make the place somewhere that is conducive for spiritual learning and spiritual wisdom. And lastly, apart from that, then there are things to do with governance. If you get the wrong person ruling the roost in that country, also down to people, right? The people on the top need to have certain basic qualities, character, moral fiber, in order to be able to lead a country in a way that will lead to spiritual values being well established. If you get someone like a dictator running the country, then that's also a person, right? Because of their values, then no matter how great or well-meaning everyone else in the country might be, but it will be very hard for them to prosper if at the top then you have someone setting a bad example. So whether it's a monarch or whether it's a president or a prime minister or a ruling party, those people have a particular responsibility to show a good example to others in order to be worth the salt of the position they're in and the influential position that they are in order for that country to be conducive in terms of personnel for spiritual values to take hold. Last but not least, we come to the idea of Dharma. Dharma you probably have heard of. The monk's supposed to give a Dharma talk, so it must be something to do with like spiritual wisdom, right? And you would be right in thinking that. Sometimes we hear in Buddhism, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. It's what the Buddha taught. So maybe it's like his teachings, maybe it's what's in the scriptures, but in actual fact it's much more than that. This word it's difficult to translate in any one particular way, because not only does it mean wisdom, but it also means what is natural. It also means what is virtuous. It also means what is just. It has all those different meanings. And this is helpful for us when we're thinking about what this word might mean on a national level, because it means the sort of ethos of that whole country, the values of the whole country, even down to the system of justice in that country, what is used to judge what is right or wrong on a national level. Yeah? On a local level, it might come down to things like the education system. What are the values which are being taught to the children in that place? Are you just teaching them to become little materialists, or are you teaching them something more than that? The neighborhood level, for children, of course, good schools are important, and we all know about like getting into the right postcode in order that our little children go to the right school. That's important. Even Buddhism would agree with that. But for adults, schools might not be so important, but if you think about lifelong learning, then how can you continue to learn as an adult in order to become spiritually more mature, no matter what age you are? Because you should continue to learn throughout your life. So what opportunities for that are available in your neighborhood, even as an adult? So don't just think of the children, also think about yourself. And the idea of spiritual knowledge is that you're particularly lucky because you've got a temple and meditation center within reach of your home. It should be a selling point for your home. And last but not least, in the family, you might think about the ethos of cultivating virtue, spiritual wisdom, even on the household level. Some households may be more conducive than others. Have you ever thought about what sort of things might make a difference? What might make a difference to whether your children pick up more spiritual values in your home or not? Any ideas? Not many? Okay, to give an example, if the whole family eats together, then there's more chance to sort of discuss or have a sense of cohesiveness in the family, and the adults get to share with their children more than if everyone's off in their own room having a TV dinner or whatever the equivalent is these days. A Netflix dinner or something. Each on their own different channel, and no one's, it's like they're just four people living under the same roof, but they don't speak to each other anymore. So the sharing of wisdom doesn't happen. Yeah? Spiritual knowledge is particularly important because there's an expression in many traditions of Buddhism that we are here in this world, but if we're not careful, we may leave this world empty-handed. And you think what this might mean? We're here, we're human beings, but if we're not careful, we might leave this world empty-handed. What do you think that means? Rather severe picture there. But this is actually from Tibetan tradition, a book called the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It's the best example I could find, I'm afraid. But if people live life and they go through life in a confused sort of way, thinking that life is about nothing more than the survival of the species, then even if they are close to sources of spiritual knowledge, they might never get around to learning any of that knowledge. They may never have the chance to cultivate good things in their lives, the sort of things they can be proud of their life for. And in the end, when they die, they might die as a person who's very afraid and lonely, because they haven't benefited spiritually from their time they spent in this world. That would be what this particular picture, Padmasambhava, or even the Buddha himself would say, that we have to be very careful of going through life and not picking up anything that we can take with us when we go. So we have to avoid leaving this world empty-handed by cultivating the maximum of spiritual virtues that will actually stay with us even as we leave this world. So, I've gone on a bit today, but I'll leave you with a little story about how being in a conducive place can affect the destiny not just of human beings, but even of humble animals. And in this particular case, it's a story about bats. Not cricket bats, like the bats that fly around. Flying mice, basically, rats. And there's a story which comes from about the 14th century. So it's when one of the Buddhist commentaries, a place called the Saddhamma Sangaha or Wakuli Watu. And we come back to a place, the place we saw in the model just now, called Ayutthaya. And there was a monk who lived there called Dhammakaya, who wrote down this chronicle. And he tells us that in the time not of this Buddha, but of the Buddha before that, you are aware there have been many Buddhas? You don't look very aware? Is it rather late for you? You know there have been many Buddhas? Not just the one? You don't look convinced? The most recent Buddha is one of a long line of Buddhas extending back into the infinite past. But it's only, there's a long time in between each of them, but in our era it's said that there are 5 Buddhas, of which the Buddha we know is the 4th, okay? And there's one more to come. But we're going back to number 3, okay? The previous Buddha, the one before the present one. Yeah? You follow? Okay. So, during that time, there was a monk, and he lived in a cave. He'd gone off into seclusion in order to train himself more in meditation. And part of his daily routine was he would get up every morning very early, and he would do some chanting. And the chanting he would chant was some chanting called the Abhidhamma, which normally these days we use for funerals, okay? But it's a very technical sort of chanting, which is all to do with the nature of the mind and how the mind works and this sort of thing in a very succinct way. And normally he would chant it not in English, not in Indian language, but in the Pali language of the scriptures, very ancient language, rather like Sanskrit. And in his cave, he was not alone, but he shared it with a lot of bats. That in the nighttime they'd all go off and fly around and eat things, and during the day they'd all come and hang upside down in his cave, which was just the time when he was doing his chanting. They would come back from their foraging and they'd be hanging upside down trying to get to sleep, and instead of getting to sleep they'd listen to his chanting. And if they were bats, do you think they could understand what he's chanting? No. But they got the gist of it, okay? Or maybe it sounded nice to them, okay? So it turned out that even though they were bats, and bats are generally not that smart, okay? But the last thing on their mind, and there were 500 of them before they died, was this pleasant sound of the chanting. So they died with this pleasant state of mind from listening to the chanting that the monk was doing. And when they passed away, all 500 of them went into the heaven realms. And in Buddhism, heaven realms isn't the end of the story, okay? Okay, you got some nods there. So after their little sojourn in heaven realms, then they came back to the human realm again. And this time they became human beings. And because they had still the same sort of affinity for the chanting, they decided, all 500 of them, to become monks. So this big group of young men became monks, and when they became monks, during their ordination, they got to hear that same chanting again. But this time, because they're human beings, it made much more sense to them. And hearing this chanting only the once, they were able to, it brought back the memory of understanding and being impressed by this in the past, and it inspired them to become enlightened in that lifetime. Just by hearing the words of the same chanting, which reminded them of something they'd heard in a distant lifetime, and they were able to become enlightened. So just by being bats in the right place at the right time, in the presence of a monk who did some chanting, he transformed their whole location into a conducive location that meant 2 lifetimes further down the road, they were able to leave the world not empty-handed, but in order to become enlightened as monks. Yeah? So for today, I will leave it there, except for doing a little bit of publicity, saying that apart from this Tuesday evening class, we also have a Thursday evening class, which has a little bit of a longer meditation. This Thursday, if you want to attend, please be warned that we have another visitation of cubs, but we are going to relocate our class to the White Room so that the cubs can have the run of the temple, and we won't have our normal teachings disturbed by their activities. Because last time we tried to do 2 in 1 and it didn't work out that successfully, at least for the class. Apart from that, we have an online class every Saturday, which you can follow by Zoom, which is between 7 and 8 p.m. in English, and that's followed by people all over Europe. And our next full moon, for those of you who liked the last one, will be on the 18th of December, so the full moon again. And the theme this time will be family harmony in the holiday season, for those of you who have to put special effort into being in close contact with all your loved ones for long periods of time over the festive season. Apart from that, for those of you who may be new to meditation today and who would like to take it away and practice it more regularly at home, there is an app for that which will help you to be able to follow meditation instruction, which you can download for free onto your cell phone, either iOS or Android, and you can time your meditations and listen to instruction for meditation from different teaching monks on that. It's called Mind Gem, and it's a good way to encourage yourself to meditate regularly, even though we have classes here only once or twice a week. So yes, if you like to meditate at home, that's a good way to keep yourself in the habit. For today, that's all I planned to share with you, but if there are any questions or comments at this point, then please feel free to put up your hand and ask.